again, like I've been following this story. I know something about this. I don't know everything about cholesterol, but like I know something about this. I've been following this, and I can say this last week, this is the first time I've heard of a different, more quantitative way to analyze plaque in the heart. Nobody talked about that. Nobody mentioned that. I didn't know this was AI powered and how accurate that would be. And again, the story that we had all collectively been told is that this is coming out really good for 94% of the people. And it's even the way you brought it up with Dr. Budoff is like the paper says, the print part of the paper says that it produced in most people stable progression, but when you look at the graph, it goes up. And so like when you brought this up to Matthew Budoff, it was interesting to, yeah, it was his reaction was very interesting to same questions. I'll just say that.
Yeah, and I mean, there are things in science we always like to be cautious and put a lot of qualifications. And so, listen, this AI technique, is it possible that there are some false positives there, that the technique is picking up some plaque where there is none? I guess that's possible. I would still be concerned because when you look, if it's error, wouldn't the error go in both directions? And so sometimes you might see as much regression as progression. And we see 90-something%. Like if you look at the graph, it's such a clear trend towards progression. It's hard to explain much of that using just the technique, unless there's some aspect of the technique that biases towards more plaque and not less. So yeah, I think I remain open to kind of technical issues, and I think we should always wait for confirmation of things, and especially in a study like this that is small and has all these issues, I wouldn't exclude changes and I wouldn't exclude other possibilities, but I would absolutely say that it's a concern. The results are a concern. And the other thing I would add is that, I mean, understanding from the point of view of most health professionals and people in this field in cardiovascular disease and lipidology, that this study doesn't exist in a vacuum. But this study looks at a disease and a risk factor where we have just a colossal amount of information going back decades. And so this is why most health professionals and most people in cardiology and lipidology are very concerned about this, because we have reason to believe that this is a problem in every context we've looked at. Here's a context where people are hoping that it will be an exception. Is that theoretically possible? Sure. Would I risk I wouldn't put my life on the line on those odds for any risk factor, right? I mean, blood pressure, sky-high blood pressure hasn't been shown to be an issue specifically on a very low-fat diet or a Jenny Craig diet or a, you know, am I going to bet my life on that being an exception? Absolutely not. And so I think this is a massive concern. I think a lot of this has to do with, like you said, people find benefits here, that things that they struggled with. And so they want to believe that it's okay. I am deeply concerned that I'm sure some people will get away with it because that's how risk factors work. But I'm deeply concerned that a number of people will have problems that could have been avoided. So yeah, this is what I would do if it was my loved one, right, that I deeply care about. Let's say they're in the position of your friend. They have these devastating health issues. Nothing else works. This works. I wouldn't tell them to go do the diet that makes them miserable, but I wouldn't leave no stone unturned. I wouldn't ignore cholesterol. I wouldn't say, oh, no, I'm sure everybody's wrong. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't play those games. I would say, look, I'm going to leave no stone unturned. If we can find tweaks of this diet that give you the benefits without the hypercholesterolemia, or if we can find some medication that, you know, that you can tolerate without problems and solves this problem, that's what I'm going to bet on.
I love that. I think that's very well balanced. You mentioned the difference and yeah, difficulty of measuring in this way. Again, I'm not very familiar with the technology. I'm just learning about it now and how it's working and giving those numbers. And there's a series of interviews on the podcast Metabolic Mind where Dr. Brett Scher interviews Matthew Budoff twice in 2 different episodes, and interviews Dave Feldman once after this had come out. And again, glowingly positive on all accounts. Caveats for sure, and they tend to bring those up. And that's where Matthew Budoff says, like, the people with plaque, we definitely recommended treatment. This is a treatment naive population. They've never been treated for this, and so that's on the table. But one of the main one of the main criticisms of the study is that the preliminary data that was the primary thing, the thing that you're measuring, were not released with this paper. And when pressed about it, Dave Feldman had to come out and like apologize. And it's almost like he didn't realize it or they didn't check it. But like the number one thing that people wanted to see was the data. And that's, people are quite upset about it. And so nobody could figure out, like, we see the lines on the paper and we see that it's trending up, but you don't really know how high it's going. And they make a prediction in the paper by how much they think it's going to go up. And then it was released by another mutual friend, Dr. Adrian Sotomoda, who came out on Twitter to say the number was 18.8 versus, I believe, 7 that they predicted originally. And so in your opinion, and another limitation, I can't remember if you mentioned this or not, but there was no control for this study. And they told us that from the very beginning. They didn't have enough money being crowdfunded to do a control, which is, understandable. But anyway, we don't really know, like, 18.8, is that a lot? Is that a little? It's more than what they thought it was. Can you talk about the rate of progression, and is the rate itself concerning, or is it also like a big relative jump, but the numbers are still, absolutely small kind of a thing?
Yeah. So regarding the specific numbers, because this has been disputed, right? Dr. Budoff, when I asked him about it, he said that was not the number. So, or that it was uncertain. He certainly didn't own that number. So anyway, let's say it's not 18.8. I don't think it makes a big difference because I've seen several scientists now who just took that figure and put it through software, and it can calculate, within a pretty good margin. And so it's around 20, give or take, right? That ballpark, 20 millimeters cubed over the year. Unless the figure is wrong. But if the figure is right, it's going to be that ballpark number. Now, is that high or low? This is the main problem, is when you don't have a control group, it's hard to know where you're sitting. So what they did in that study was they compared, which I think is reasonable, is they had a supplementary table where they said, this is the value for our study, and here they actually used something else. They had some other measure. They didn't use this soft plaque progression. That's another point that some people criticized. They used some other metric called PAV, plaque atheroma volume. Anyway, it's another metric of plaque and the percentage of the lumen that is occupied by plaque. So they used that number, and they looked at that corresponding number from other existing studies in other populations that are obviously not similar to this in many ways. But basically they said, okay, it's comparable, it's similar in general to these other to the rate of growth in these other populations. There's a lot of problems with these comparisons because these populations have a lot of differences, right? So these are kind of for typical Westerners. Usually blood pressure is not great and cholesterol is not great, and they're a little chubby, and some smoke, some have diabetes. There's a, kind of a more typical population. And also a chunk of these people are usually on statins or equivalent drugs. So it's like at face value, it's not very reassuring because you're seeing a plaque growth that is in the ballpark of these fairly sick Westerners that are being followed up with these with these imaging techniques for heart disease. On the other hand, there is a valid criticism there, which is the statins, because we know that statins will slow down and stop plaque growth. And so these folks, a percentage of them are on statins. So that will slow down the plaque in these comparison groups, whereas this group, the keto group in this study, was not on medication, not on lipid-lowering medication. So one argument is, okay, it's not apples to apples. It's making the keto group look worse because these guys with the statins, are artificially slowing down their plaque progression. I think that's a reasonable argument. I think there's some truth there. So one thing I try to do in my video, which is also not without complications by any stretch, is I use another cohort where they're not on statins, so 0 statins, and they're actually a pretty healthy group for Westerners, for Western standards, for US. So no diabetes whatsoever in that group, and they're healthier. The idea was, let's look at plaque progression in a healthier group of individuals. What's like the natural progression of plaque? And so what I showed in that video is that what they reported, this isn't fully published yet, but it was the abstract, the summary of the results was released in a meeting last year. And so it was about 5 millimeters cubed over a year of soft plaque progression, median. And I said in the video, so this would be 5 in these guys, and then 18.8 or whatever in that range for the keto group. Now, Dr. Budoff has also pointed out that this isn't also a great comparison because you have to match for baseline plaque individual by individual, that it's a very rough comparison. And I think he has a point. So bottom line, the comparisons are dirty. We don't have a great comparison because you don't have an internal control. We already know from the get-go it's going to be like that. Looking at the numbers at face value, the numbers that we have and that have been released, same thing that I said before. I think it's a concern. I would not be reassured if I was in this position. I would not want this rate of plaque progression. The other thing to add context, we have a lot of information on plaque progression in other contexts. We know that there are diets shown in randomized trials, actually, so a higher standard of evidence. Diets that stop plaque progression, diets that reverse plaque progression. This has all been shown. So, you know, Mediterranean diets and DASH diets and things like that have been shown to reverse plaque. These medications have been shown to reverse plaque when you push these risk factors low enough. So I would always be very worried about having someone growing plaque over the long run when we know that's not necessary. Yeah, I would just say it's a concern all around for me based on the evidence that we have. And I know that I think I've made this clear, there's a lot of question marks and a lot of haziness because of the experimental design. We knew that was going to be like that. But I actually think the results were a bit more startling than I expected. I expected them to be a bit more gray, a bit more unclear, but they leaned more in the direction of concern than what I thought was going to come out. So
fair point.